Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie Bockel. I'm the co-executive director of NJ11th for Change. Welcome to tonight's Defending Democracy presentation, Reparations, What You Need to Know. I'd like to say hello to Mara Novak, our other co-executive director, who's behind the scenes tonight, making sure everything goes smoothly for us on the tech end. And an extra special thanks and welcome to our co-sponsors, SOMA Action. I'm pleased to introduce Barbara Velasquez from SOMA Action's Racial Justice team. Hi, Barbara. You want to say hello?
Hello. Hi.
Hey there. You want to say a little bit about SOMA Action, Racial Justice, and your mission?
Okay. Well, SOMA Action is a grassroots organization in South Orange and Maplewood, and we fondly combine the two and call it SOMA. We're focused on driving progressive change, and we welcome all those who share progressive values and want to make change happen. Now, the issue committees are the heart of SOMA Action. Our committees take the lead by crafting positions and actions. And I'm the chair of the SOMA Action Racial Justice Committee. And we're committed to raising awareness and addressing the structural racism that persists at every level of American society. We run programs, events, and activities that seek to empower, inform, and motivate Black and Brown people and their allies. At the local level, we work with grassroots groups such as 11 for Change, organizations and activists to promote our common causes. And we're very happy to co-sponsor this program, very meaningful program.
Thanks, Barbara. And thanks to everyone for being here tonight, just a few days before Juneteenth. The idea of reparations is controversial. Compensating Black people today for the cumulative multi-generational harm resulting from centuries of slavery and structural racism seems reasonable and seems fair. But once we start talking about implementing reparations, the conversation always seems to break down. Tonight, as we all listen and learn, I hope you'll share your questions with us. You can type them in the chat down at the bottom of your screen, or if you're watching on Facebook, type them in the comments. We encourage you to ask challenging and provocative questions, questions that bring up your own concerns, or questions that are about objections you might have heard floating around in your communities or on the national level. Tonight's an opportunity to address them and think them through. If you have a question you'd like to ask anonymously, you can post it just to Barbara, Mara, and me in the chat rather than to everyone. And now for the main event, I'm thrilled to introduce Ryan Haygood. Ryan is a nationally respected civil rights lawyer. As president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, he leads a team of racial justice advocates whose cutting-edge work seeks to build reparative systems that create wealth, justice, and power for people of color in New Jersey. Before joining the Institute, Ryan served as Deputy Director of Litigation at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, where he worked for more than a decade. While there, he defended a core provision of the Voting Rights Act, one of the nation's greatest pieces of civil rights legislation, before the United States Supreme Court. Ryan, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for the chance to join you, and to Mara for doing the background work tonight, and also to Barbara for joining from SOMA Action for co-hosting this event. Before we came on live, I was just talking to the team about how thankful I am that you all have tackled this particular issue. And I can't think of a better time to be talking about this issue than the week leading up to Juneteenth. And this will be on Saturday, New Jersey's first recognition of Juneteenth as a state holiday. So I'll say a bit about how I'd love for you to join us on Saturday. I just want to provide some sort of context for how I think we got to here, and I'll talk about what here is, and then what I think we are to do while here. But I did just want to lift up Leslie's point. I have the really distinct privilege of working at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice with a fantastic team of really fierce advocates who do courageous and cutting edge work. Part of our mission or our sort of goals are to push so hard that we make folks in power feel uncomfortable, and by extension, we find ourselves very uncomfortable as well. So I just want to lift up one of the values of doing this work is around feeling uncomfortable as a natural outgrowth of this work. And I do see I'm really fortunate to be joined by our communications director, Lori Beecham, and I'll say a word about some of her work as part of my presentation. So I wanted to just share, as part of this discussion, some slides. I'd love for folks, if you have questions at any time in my presentation, to feel free to lift them up, and then I look forward to a really robust discussion on the other side. So first manner of business is sharing my screen. Can you all see that? First time, excellent. So, so the subject of reparations, I'm excited to dig into this as part of tonight's conversation. And I've been thinking a lot about this moment here. And that this is an image that our colleague at the Institute, Jake, created, which captures really how we've been thinking about this particular moment, right? So this moment being one where we're trying to work our way out of the coronavirus pandemic that has killed more than 500,000 people, as we're in the throes of a broader police brutality pandemic. I'll talk a bit about that. And then as we're part of a broader structural racism pandemic. And this is a picture, obviously, of a young Black boy standing on a foundation. And you'll see that the foundation is cracked. And these are cracks, as we think of them, of structural racism. And that in this particular moment, these cracks of structural racism are causing or have caused real earthquakes in Black communities and other communities of color more broadly. But what's really important about this particular image is that, like this young Black boy, we did not create those cracks, right? We inherited a cracked foundation. And I think the charge for us as people of conscience is that even though we didn't create this foundation, we didn't create the structural racism, we've inherited it. And I think it's our charge to take responsibility for the cracks in the foundation, though we did not create them. And that's part of how I'll frame the reparations conversation. And so with respect to those cracks, this is a striking image that you see is from the New Yorker magazine. This was the cover back in June of 2020. It's obviously an outline of George Floyd. I have really been struck by this image. I'm 45 years old. And in the very center of Mr. Floyd's outline, you'll see a white car. That's a Hyundai, the old school version of the Hyundai. And there are some folks standing up. Turns out those are 4 Los Angeles police officers hovering over Rodney King, right? And this is March 3rd, 1991, when I was in high school. And why I find this image so striking is because I remember that was one of the early incidents of police brutality captured on video. And the thinking then was that if you could capture police brutality against then Black folks and that has endured, then you could solve for it. And yet 30 years later, we're having an identical conversation as the one we had when I was in high school, as the one we had a generation before with respect to Emmett Till. And there's a through line of this sort of police brutality against Black folks that I think flows directly from those cracks in our foundation. Dr. King said, you don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step. And this is an image that Lori and our colleague Jake helped to create, which really captures a lot of our work. So at the Institute, we focus really intensely on racial disparities. We do a lot of research and writing to understand where those racial disparities come from, their historical roots, and then our policy work, our advocacy work is designed through very strategic advocacy to fill in those cracks in our foundation through practices, through policies, through legislation, and through litigation. So I just want to offer a few reactions. So this is, as you can see, a staircase, which I think is a really apt metaphor for what life is like for adults, right? That we as adults, as young people, as people in life, all confront a staircase. And the staircase represents challenges that we both confront and overcome. But this particular staircase, by the numbers, lays bare how incredibly steep the staircase is for Black people in New Jersey. And so if you look at the second staircase, this is a staircase that features New Jersey's racial wealth gap. The second stair reveals that the median net wealth for white families in New Jersey is $352,000. This is the highest net wealth of any family in the country, right here in New Jersey. Median net wealth, white families, $352,000. This is largely connected to home ownership, right, which is one of the primary drivers of wealth. But if you look at the VS, for all my lawyers on the phone, you know that usually spells a contrast. So the VS is that for Black families, the median net wealth in New Jersey is just $6,100, right? Incredible racial wealth gap. I'm going to talk a bit about where that comes from and how that connects to reparations. I just want to offer up one more racial disparity because it relates to this young Black boy at the bottom of the stairs. If you go up two more, you'll see 21-to-1. And that's the Black to white incarceration disparity rate for young kids, which means, put differently, that in New Jersey, a Black child is 21 times more likely to be in prison than a white child, even though Black and white kids commit most offenses at about the same rate. And that even where there are differences in the commission of crime, it certainly doesn't justify disparity at that level. And that in fact, what that racial disparity reflects in youth incarceration is that we have very different approaches responding to crime when it's committed by Black kids versus white kids. And we know that both because Black and white kids commit most offenses at about the same rate, but also because New Jersey, a state of 9 million people, has just 8 white kids in prison. 8. Now, Lori and I and our team are not advocating for the deeper incarceration of white kids, but what we have learned is that we as a state have been able to marshal compassion and resources when white children get in trouble with the law, but we've not been able to find that same level of compassion for Black kids. Last thing I'll say here is that we make an extraordinary investment, financial resources in incarcerating kids, so that under Governor Murphy's budget this year, New Jersey is spending $445,000 to incarcerate each young person. So for the educators in the line, I ask you, can you imagine, or the social workers, or those who work with young people in some capacity, can you imagine what you could do in the life of a young person if you could invest nearly $500,000 a year in their lives? And the reason it's so high is because we have been reducing the youth prison population substantially, but we continue to staff our youth prisons with adults as if they're at capacity. And so that is, and I think, I lift this point up because as a state, we have had a deep willingness to invest almost any amount in incarcerating young folks, particularly Black and brown kids. Our push has been to reinvest those dollars back into community-based programs that actually help to keep communities safe. On the subject of young people, this is a story I love to tell as often as I can. I mentioned educators, and this is my wife, Charity, with the A on her shirt. She's the principal at Avon Avenue School, and she's surrounded by her team. And this is a photo that was taken at the very beginning of the pandemic last March. And it was at a time when the superintendent of Newark, as superintendents across the country were urging their administrators to make sure that they got their computers, all the computers in the school, to the kids at home so they could learn online and at home. And so Charity and her team delivered every computer they had in the building. They were able to reach each family. The challenge, though, was that there were some families that had more than one scholar. And so what that meant for those families is that they'd have to share their computers. And as you can imagine, even if we're trying to have this conversation tonight, sharing computers, it could be challenging, right? And so there's a gentleman whose name is Michael Rowe. And he once hosted a show called Dirty Jobs. I love this show. He now hosts a show called Returning the Favor. And Michael Rowe learned that Charity and her team were delivering computers and that they were a bit short. So in this incredible act of generosity, Michael Rowe donates $25,000 to Avon Avenue School. And with that money, Charity is able to buy about 125 computers. And she and her team, you see the computers here on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. She and her team deliver each of those computers to each kid so that there's now a one-to-one kid-to-computer ratio. Really incredible act of generosity and a couple of incredible acts of heroism. And these are two of Charity's students who received the computer. And I want to do this picture justice because I think if Charity were here, she were telling the story, she would say there are a lot of things you will see immediately about this photo, including how shameful it is that kids learn in these conditions, right? She would say, like, those are the obvious takeaways from this photo. But she would also focus you on how this in a really concrete way is an illustration, an embodiment of perseverance and strength, and how notwithstanding what the naked eye sees, you can also see in the young man in the legendary t-shirt with the erect posture, a real focus that my wife would say can lead that young boy someday to become an attorney or a social worker, right? With that level of focus. And she would say in the young boy in the yellow t-shirt with this really beautiful posture could be a dancer. You might find him at NJPAC or on Broadway. She lifted up the qualities you see that come from this picture. She'd also talk about the ingenuity of these boys, that they created for themselves desks and seats, and they moved their computers to the window sill here because at that time, they didn't have internet access. So they had the world's most powerful device in their laps, but they didn't have a way to get on because in this photo, they didn't have a hotspot that was later provided by the school. And so they moved their computers to the window and they were able to borrow one of their neighbor's Wi-Fi. But my wife would also say that probably the biggest takeaway from this picture is that individual acts of heroism, whether it be a $25,000 gift from a national figure like Michael Rowe, whether it be a principal and her team literally going into harm's way in the throes of the pandemic to deliver computers to their scholars, that those individual acts of heroism are not replacements for systems that really ought to be in place to empower communities. Or put differently, that individual acts of heroism are not supplements for broken systems. And you see that most clearly in this photo. This is a tweet that I sent into the world shortly after our colleague, Laura Sullivan, did some really incredible original research and writing and came up with this data point looking at the individual net wealth of people in New Jersey. I talked about the median net wealth of families in the previous slide, but my colleague, Laura Sullivan, was able to discern the individual net wealth of adults in New Jersey. She found that the individual net wealth for Black people in New Jersey is just 179 United States dollars. Lori likes to say that's less than the cost of a laptop. It's less than the cost of the laptops that the boys in the previous screen were using. But for New Jersey's white people, it's $106,210. And then I say in this tweet, New Jersey designed it that way during slavery. So I just want to say a bit about how this racial wealth gap that has persisted to this year, 2021, was designed hundreds of years ago in New Jersey to really get at the question people often ask, well, like slavery was like way back then. And when you talk about repairing the harm of slavery, how can you repair something that was like way back then, right? Further than my arms can reach. And what I'm going to argue here is that slavery wasn't way back then alone, that it has endured, that we live in the legacy of slavery to this day, as is manifested in a number of ways on those stairs, including right here in this racial wealth gap, that for Black people, the individual net wealth in New Jersey is less than $200. Well, how can that be? Well, that's because slavery took root very, very deeply in New Jersey. This is a historical marker in Camden on Cooper Street. which was a major port for bringing enslaved Black folks into New Jersey, where they were ultimately owned as property and made to work for free for a very long time. This is an image that I like to show outlining the shape of New Jersey in a Confederate flag. I've actually shared this in previous conversations, and folks have actually taken real offense to this, in part because I think we should talk more about this in the conversation. New Jersey is often seen as one of the most progressive states in the country, and people often do not appreciate that slavery took root very, very deeply here. I've heard very often people in New Jersey, no disrespect, I'm originally from Denver, I've been here for 20 years, so I'm claiming Jersey, but folks, native New Jerseyans often contrast the history of New Jersey to that of states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. In fact, there are more similarities historically around slavery than we often like to recognize. And Lori recently found this article that called New Jersey, the slave state of the North, right? And so this report that we recently wrote, my colleagues, Andrea McChristian and Laura Sullivan wrote this report, which had as its premise that from our founding as a colony, New Jersey created a racial exclusive system for distributing property. And that system that we created in slavery has led to the stark racial wealth gap that we see today. Just a few slides to make this point. So New Jersey provided each English settling white family with 150 acres of land. And it also provided those very families an additional 60 acres of land for each enslaved Black person who worked on that land. So as a colony, when we were formed, New Jersey gave each English white settling family land, 150 acres, and then it incentivized those families owning enslaved Black people by giving those families an additional 60 acres for each person who worked on that land. Such that by the mid-1800s, the slide says that more than 2/3 of all enslaved Black people in the North were held captive right here in New Jersey. And after becoming the last Northern state to finally end formal slavery, New Jersey then developed its own form of sharecropping, which was referred to then as cottaging. So from slavery to cottaging, right? And then I just want to talk a bit about how there's this direct line from the enslavement of Black people in New Jersey to today's racial wealth gap. So it went from slavery to sharecropping or cottaging, then to restrictive covenants, which prevented Black folks from living in certain areas, then to the denial of home ownership opportunities through the GI Bill for Black World War II veterans who returned, then to Jim Crow segregation, which took root very, very deeply in the North and here in New Jersey, then to redlining, then to exclusionary zoning policies, then to predatory lending practices to today's racial wealth gap. So there's not been a break from slavery to the things that follow that maintain the level of inequality, including the racial wealth gap, which was conceived of in slavery. And by the way, I'm happy I'll provide the slides to Leslie, Amara, and Barbara, and you can hold on to them. And so I lift that up because I think that you have to have that historical context in mind as we think about, yes, the history, but also the future. So I love this quote from Amanda Gorman at President Biden's inauguration, where she said, while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. That as we look forward, the past is looking at us. And I think it's fair to say that both history and the future require us in this particular moment to really begin to repair those cracks in our foundation. In previous moments, we've started to have conversations. We started to say words like Black Lives Matter. I now think in this moment, in order to make those Black lives really matter, we got to start thinking about how we repair the harm from the original sin of our state and country, slavery, and grapple with its enduring impact. And so I want to say a word about how we've been doing this work in New Jersey. This is work that's not new. I have a fantastic team of colleagues. We don't claim to be the originators of this effort. I talked extensively to Larry Ham, who, as folks know, is one, legendary, and two, leads the People's Organization for Progress. And he told me that this effort has really been going on 30 years back to when there were efforts to get New Jersey to divest from South Africa, which then led to efforts to get an apology from New Jersey around its involvement in slavery that led to attempts to get a reparations task force bill or a truth and reconciliation bill passed. And so we're just building on an at least 30-year focus effort to get legislation passed, but easily going back to the foundation of this state to finally get to the conversation around how you repair that harm. And so as part of that conversation, we brought, along with a bunch of partners, including NJPAC and Rutgers and Prudential and others, Salvation and Social Justice, Nicole Hannah-Jones, the creator of the Genius 1619 Project, to speak to a sold-out audience at NJPAC on a Saturday night. And what was fascinating was that this was a moment where she had just released the project. It was getting lots of acclaim. She has since won every award one can win, including the Pulitzer for journalism. And it was really when, you know, she made this argument that yes, there's 1776 is a meaningful date in America's history, but that 1619, the year when 20 or so enslaved Black people arrived at Jamestown, Virginia, that's a key marker for America. Could be argued as its actual founding, because it so profoundly shaped the history, the course of this country, and the beginning of the inequality that has persisted over time. I do want to lift up that when you talked about this uncomfortableness that travels with doing this work, and Nicole, though she offered a real gift to this country in the 1619 Project, has been excoriated. President Trump came for her regularly. She was recently offered tenure at the University of North Carolina. And then when she took the position, the board of the University of North Carolina, which by the way is her alma mater, walked back the tenure. And this is all because she's just telling the truth about what 1619 has meant to this country and how it shaped this country. So we were really honored to stand with her back in November as she shared again before a sold out audience at NJPAC her work. And this is a group of folks who were on the stage as part of that conversation. And I lift this up because it was significant to bring her to New Jersey, because the conversation about slavery has been in America for a while. We really wanted to talk about how, yes, there's a national conversation around repairing harm from slavery, but we also need to have that conversation in our states, including right here in New Jersey. And so shortly after we had that conversation with Nicole, we stood with a number of courageous legislators, faith leaders, and partners in Trenton to get a bill introduced that would create a New Jersey reparations task force. And so this bill would create a task force that would do two things. The first thing is that the task force would look at New Jersey's role in slavery, as we've sort of discussed briefly. The second thing it would do is the task force would make recommendations around the kinds of policies that need to be put in place to fill in those cracks in our foundation that we talked about, and the kinds of investments that we need to make in communities separated from things like wealth, like health, like educational opportunities, right? Like justice. So this task force would be a real compilation of some of the best thinkers in their respective fields, interdisciplinary fields, that would study deeply the history of New Jersey's role in slavery and then make recommendations. I will say to you that on this day, this was November of 2019, when the bill was introduced, no state in the country had ever passed this kind of law. There's a federal piece of legislation called HR 40, which was introduced by the late John Conyers 35 years ago, which had not moved at this moment. And then we launched a campaign recently. This was, I'm so glad that Lori is in the line, because this was really her genius. And I will say to you that this campaign, called Say the Word Reparations, was inspired by a conversation that we had with the Assembly Speaker, Craig Coughlin. We had been pushing for this task force after it was introduced. Speaker Coughlin shared with us that, he would support this kind of task force right away if we called it something other than reparations. He asked, why reparations? Why can't you call it an economic justice task force or some other version of that task force? Why do you need the word reparations in the task force? Because after all, reparations, this is to the point that was made earlier, reparations, the word reparations, it unsettles people, right? It causes folks, among other things, great consternation. It makes people uncomfortable. Why would you have a task force with that word? And we said to Speaker Coughlin, one, the concession that we're making is that we're asking you for a task force. As you all know, if you work closely with elected officials, that very often when elected officials don't want to do something, they create a task force. That task force assembles for a year or two or more. They issue a report, and the report goes on a shelf somewhere, right? And there it stays. But given the substantial undertaking that's required by this conversation around reparations, around repairing harm, around fashioning policies to fill the cracks of structural racism in our foundation, we think that a task force is the most meaningful way to proceed in New Jersey. So we said back to him, the word reparations needs to be in the task force. It needs to be called the New Jersey Reparations Task Force. And so we launched a campaign really inspired by this idea that Lori came up with. It. We want to try to take the sting out of the word, right? Some time ago, not long ago, people didn't want to say the word race, frankly. And after that, there was hesitation around saying Black Lives Matter, right? And we've moved the conversation just by reclaiming the language to be clear about what we want. And now saying the word reparations is designed to make Black Lives Matter really by repairing harm, advancing policy. So this is a campaign that we have launched. We'll talk more about that at the rally on the Saturday. I'll say a word about that. But that's what this campaign is designed to do. And so this was a tweet I offered right after we introduced that legislation, talked about how John Conyers fought for 30 years or more to pass HR 40. I said, New Jersey can become the first state to take responsibility for its role in America's original sin and repair the enduring harm by passing this bill. After we got our bill introduced, California, inspired by our bill, introduced its own bill. And California in 2020 passed a California Reparations Task Force. And they met for the first time a few weeks ago. So New Jersey won't, unfortunately, we won't be the first state to do it, but I'm confident that with our collective advocacy, we could become the second. This is a slide that just says that a House panel that looked at the federal piece of legislation had a hearing and began to move that legislation along. So it's been fascinating to see that within 2 years, the conversation around the Reparations Task Force bill, which hadn't moved for many, many years, has both had a hearing, is beginning to move some, and even President Biden is talking about the issue. And so this is a tool that we have that's called Phone to Action. The address is 400yearsnj.org. And you go to 400yearsnj.org, and it allows you, put a little bit of information, and it allows you to interact directly with your elected officials and the state legislature. And it allows you to interact directly with the governor. And this, as you all know, is a key year in New Jersey because every seat is up in both the Assembly and the Senate, 120 seats, and the governor's running for re-election. So this is a key moment, really, as the flyer says, to tell your legislators to pass a reparations task force bill. The bill is S322 A711 now. And so we've been pushing hard to get our legislature to move the bill. I will say it was introduced in 19, reintroduced this year, and we haven't yet had a hearing for this bill, which again would create a reparations task force. So we hosted in February a press conference with a number of faith leaders from various faiths. I love this quote from Bishop Chip Stokes. He's the 12th Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey, and he has led the effort within his church to create a reparations task force and look at the role that his church played in slavery. He says, after more than 400 years of hideous wrong, it's time to face and repair the enduring harm of slavery. Each of these faith leaders spoke powerfully, including Reverend Nora Sandler from the Universal Unitarian Church in Montclair, who said, everyone in New Jersey has benefited from or been harmed by slavery. She said, I have benefited. She said, Governor Murphy, you have benefited. Speaker Coughlin, you have benefited. And she said, New Jersey must pass the Reparations Task Force bill now. And so I say to you all that I invite you to join us this Saturday in Newark at 12 o'clock, as you'll see in this flyer, for a Juneteenth rally and march in support of the Reparations Task Force bill. As I shared, this is the first year that New Jersey is celebrating Juneteenth as a state holiday, which is significant. And we want to make that commemoration concrete by harnessing the energy around the day to move this task force bill forward. We're really fortunately joined by a number of organizations. You can see them featured at the bottom, and it's going to be a powerful day. We'll meet at the Lincoln Memorial at noon, symbolic, right? Because President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which gave rise to the Juneteenth celebration. Interestingly, New Jersey then rejected the Emancipation Proclamation. So there's a bit of irony in us celebrating Juneteenth, though as a state, we originally rejected the Emancipation Proclamation when President Abraham Lincoln signed it. But we'll meet at the Lincoln Memorial at 12. There'll be some speakers there. We'll then walk, it's about a half a mile to Newark City Hall, where there'll be some additional speakers. At Newark City Hall, we'll have Mayor Baraka speak. We'll have Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver speak. Senator Cory Booker will participate there. We'll have Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman and Congressman Payne, and then a number of sponsors of the bill, our partners, faith leaders, advocates, and more. Really excited about both commemorating Juneteenth and using it to move this bill. I have every confidence that we will move this bill when we apply enough pressure. And I end with this quote here from Dr. King. I love this quote. We think a lot at the Institute about what victory ultimately looks like what is an affirmative vision for winning. And Dr. King captured it so powerfully here in facing the challenge of a new age when he said, more than 50 years ago, the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. And part of that reconciliation, redemption, I think, also leads to reparation and the creation of the beloved community. And I think that this effort around creating a reparations task force is central to that effort. And so I'll pause there. Looking forward to folks' reactions, comments, questions, and interaction. And thanks again for the invitation to be here.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Really appreciate your taking that deep dive with us. Before we jump into sort of conceptual level questions, we had a couple questions while you were speaking about sort of some of the nitty gritty of what you presented. And there were questions about kids in prison that our member Gail Lolf brought up. Gail, would you be game to ask Ryan what you were curious about?
Gail needs to unmute herself, so I can't unmute her.
Mm-hmm.
There she is.
Gail, are you there? Or I can ask your questions if you'd prefer.
I am here.
Oh, great.
Sorry, I got a call and I had to cut out for a second.
So you had questions about what was meant by kids in prison?
Yeah, so I was looking at, on those first few slides, I wanted to just get a clarification on some of the definitions. You mentioned kids in prison, and I wanted to know what the age range was and what you meant, or you said kids locked up, and I wanted to know what you meant by locked up, whether that included like juvenile detention or something else.
Yeah, great question. So the average age of kids in prison, and so of young people in youth prisons, is 18, which GAIL means that there are, I mean, obviously the kids are, I think, as young as 14, but there are also young people who are as old as 22. And I was speaking about New Jersey has 3 youth prisons. It's worth mentioning them because one of them is Jamesburg. Jamesburg is now about 154 years old. Jamesburg, the history of Jamesburg is fascinating. It's called the Training School for Boys. The Civil War ends in 1865, and Jamesburg opens in 1867. And it remains a segregated prison in the sense that they're mostly Black and brown kids. So that's a larger prison for boys. Then there's a JMSF, which is a juvenile medium secure facility, which is a medium-sized, medium secure facility. And then there's a youth prison for girls called Hayes, which by last count has 4 girls in it. And this story it tells itself. So both JMSF and Hayes are in Bordentown, and they are on the campus of what was called the Bordentown School for Colored Youth. It was a school that New Jersey opened. It was an elite public boarding school for Black youth during segregation. And it was a school that was visited by luminaries like Albert Einstein, Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois. The school was actually called the Tuskegee of the North. It was modeled after Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And it produced some incredible graduates. And it ran for about 70 years. And then it closed right around the time of Brown. And in the last 20 years or so has been home to 2 of New Jersey's 3 youth prisons. And I took some time to tell that story, Gil, because that is literally the school to prison pipeline realized. I mean, literally the administrative building of the Bordentown School for Colored Youth is still there.
I had no idea what that was all new to me. I did not know any of that. Yeah.
We didn't know. Our colleague Andrea McChristen just did some poking around and she discovered that story. And I lift that up because I do think part of the reparations conversation is really around what kinds of investments we make and what investments we don't make. And so in New Jersey, we have exhibited an extraordinary willingness to invest very deeply in prison for Black kids. But we've not made those same kinds of investments in things that would empower Black and brown kids.
So we have an entire facility with 4 girls in it?
We do. So Gail, with it right now in New Jersey, so the youth prisons have the capacity to hold about 515 kids, and there are less than 100 in them all told. So on one hand, we can say we have, as a state, we've done a wonderful job of reducing the number of kids in prison. The challenge is that we have, even as we've reduced the overall population, racial disparities have exploded so that we have the worst. And we have been unwilling, if I could snap my fingers, right, and wish something, it'd be that we actually have a small enough population of young people in prison that we can close those prisons. We can move kids to other facilities to give them the care they need. And we could invest an extraordinary amount of money into front-end programs around prevention and diversion. And then for rehabilitative purposes, we can invest in programs to help kids come back whole. At less than 100 kids, New Jersey could actually redesign youth justice in a way that could serve as a national model. But here's the thing, this is really a conversation about race. If we were on the line, we just get honest with ourselves, and there were just 8 Black kids in prison and the rest were white, we'd be quickly finding all manner of solutions to close those youth prisons. But because those kids are mostly Black, overwhelmingly Black and brown, we have exhibited an appetite to continue to pour money into these youth prisons, which, by the way, fail. Substantial number of kids who leave those youth prisons reoffend and return to those prisons in a very short period of time after leaving. And so part of the work, is really, we've got a number of bills seeking to invest deeper resources in front-end programs and in rehabilitative programs. But the bigger ask really is to close the youth prisons and reimagine what public safety looks like for our young people.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay,
Ryan.
Of course.
We've got so much to cover, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Barbara, would you like to jump into some of the big picture questions about reparations and what they mean?
Okay. Yes, we do have quite a few really good questions concerning, yes, reparations and what they might consist of. I don't know. What I will do is I'll name the person who asked the question, and then I'll ask what question they had. The first one is a very basic question. When we talk about reparations, and this is from Denise Stone, can you clarify if this only refers to monetary reparations?
Yeah, great question. So, I think that investments are certainly part of the conversation, right? But I hesitate, so you have the Evanston, Illinois example, right? Which, not to diminish that effort there, but it provided a $25,000 check to some number of descendants of enslaved Black people. That's a recent effort. The challenge there is that I think reducing reparations to a check writing exercise, particularly to individuals, doesn't get at the structures that led to the need for reparations in the first place, right? So I lifted up the racial wealth gap. On the national level, right? National level, it would take the average Black family 228 years to achieve the average wealth that white people have right now, right? Right now. Think about that. It would take 228 years for the average Black family nationally to achieve the wealth that the average white family has in this instant, in this right now. And so there's a real question about, so how did we get there? And part of, because we talk about how the racial wealth gap is animated by disparity in home ownership. In New Jersey, about 80% of white families own their homes. 41% of Black families do. In the city of Newark, where I live, I'm fortunate to own my home, but only 20% of people in Newark own their homes. So 80% of people in Newark rent. And if home ownership is the primary driver of wealth, how do you connect Black people to wealth when we have very low percentages of home ownership? And if that's the primary driver of wealth, how does that? So part of reparations is, so what are some of the best strategies to deepen home ownership in areas where it's very low? And so I think there's got to be, but part of the conversation is certainly about financial investments. But when I think about those, if I had my druthers, and the task force, by the way, the task force would really decide how this would happen. But part of the charge of the task force would have to be thinking about how you begin to build wealth through policies, like how you structure policies and practices, laws that begin to fill in those cracks. And writing a check of any amount won't get to the structural challenges that have persisted since slavery. So I think it's a more comprehensive question. I'm really interested in the policies that animate the racial disparities, that perpetuate the structural racism. And I think part of that conversation is around investments, but an individual check won't do it. And the last thing I'll say on that is, and then after, the challenge with individual check is that once it's written, folks are like, you did that. Check written, you should be good. But it almost doesn't matter what amount the check is written for, because you wouldn't have replaced that broken foundation. That foundation was created by system, policies, and practices, and you will need to replace that foundation before you can get to any discussion about writing checks.
So you're saying basically like make those structural changes that allow people to acquire wealth. I think of two questions. One, is there no cash payment at all? And the other one is, does it still take 200 odd years to rectify that situation that you mentioned?
Yeah, I love that question, Barbara, because I think that's why just writing a check is a challenge, right? Because you'd be hard to overcome these incredible racial disparities by just writing checks. So I think investments, check writing, direct payments, all that should be a part of the conversation, to be sure. But the harder lift, and I think the more meaningful lift, is really around, look, we have a racial wealth gap because we designed it that way. We incentivize as a state home ownership by giving families acres of land. And then we said, and by the way, if you add enslaved people to work on that land, we'll give you more land. Like, that's a policy decision, right? And so you can't, like, we have to contend with that reality. And then we said, so that's going to be our foundation, slavery and enslaving people. And then we're going to end slavery, and then we're going to follow that up, though, with a system of policies and practices that will ensure that the inequality built into our founding will persist into 2021. And that we have, as a state, we have to grapple with that. How do you interrupt that? And so that's a conversation around, in a number of our policies, we produced a policy document called Making Black Lives Matter. Really, we lift up a number of things: deepening home ownership, canceling student loan debt, guaranteed income, baby bonds, right? There are a number of ways to get there. Making college, free. I mean, low interest loans. I mean, there's all kinds of ways you could get there just on the racial wealth gap. But all of this, I think, to your question, Barbara, speaks to the need to create a task force, have a really thoughtful discussion about how to go about doing it.
It's much more complex than meets the eye. Far more complex.
I mean, for a number of years, I litigated cases on race, right? And I think that's why I appreciate you all for having the courage to have this conversation, because race has to be one of the most difficult subjects. I would regularly have experts who are historians, experts who are sociologists, experts who are demographers, experts who are economists, right? Just on the subject of race, because it implicates all of those disciplines. It's a substantial undertaking that simply writing a check won't address, not meaningfully.
It's fascinating, exciting.
Let me invite, I know I'm looking at Lori, and we talked a bunch about this. I want to put her on the spot, but I wanted to ask her to say a few words if she wanted to weigh in on that point, because that's one that we wrestle with quite a bit internally.
So thank you, Ryan. You mean on the point about what it should look like? No, I think you're right. And it's funny, I've never heard you say it quite like that, but I think that's exactly on target. I think that it has to be part of the conversation, writing checks. But while that's the thing that kind of makes everybody go crazy, I think that's actually only a part of it. And I think that the deep policy work, which we're doing every day at the Institute, but I think framed in reparative justice is the really powerful work that will change systems over time. And while you're putting me on the spot, I'll also just take the moment to say that I think what's so great about this conversation that we're having now is that I think, and we talk a lot about this at the Institute also, is that this movement needs to be a racially diverse movement, that we're much more powerful when we have racially diverse voices. I think all of us have lived through the last year, and we've seen the racial reckoning that's happened, and we all sort of ask ourselves, is this the moment where things are really going to be different? Or is this another one of those moments that's going to sort of fade out until the next, big moment of crisis happens? And I think one of the things that, I'm not saying anything original, but a lot of people have made note of is that the streets were filled with millions of people last summer of all races and all demographic groups. And that's what gives me a lot of hope. it's not the only thing that gives me hope, but it is an aspect that gives me a lot of hope that this moment can be different. And I think groups like this pulling together and taking the time to educate ourselves and putting ourselves out there is really going to make a difference. And that's, I think, part of the beauty of our Say the Word campaign is that it lets people as individuals own that and say the word. I mean, I won't go into the whole campaign now, but we're going to have a Facebook profile frame that you could put around your profile in it. And for some people, that's a courageous act. And I think it's a time where we're all being pushed to, as Ryan said, be a little uncomfortable, but do what we know is right and join together. So thank you for that opportunity to say a few words.
So one question that came to us is how do you respond to people in the community who say, oh, but there was affirmative action that should have covered everything. Everything should be fine now. How do you respond to pushback on that level? And while I'm talking, another question came up about is there room for something like that's structured like the GI Bill that could work as part of reparations? Yeah.
So I think those are great questions. I mean, affirmative action was designed to repair harm, right, from American apartheid. What's interesting, right, is that there's a fair argument to be made that white women benefited most from affirmative action, right? And that people of color continue to, struggle. I mean, those racial disparities I articulated are probably the best answer to that we need more, right? And I don't think as a country, we've ever really had an honest conversation around like this conversation we're having now. When we've, a lot of our work, we have an economic justice pillar of work. We have a criminal justice reform body of work and a democracy and justice body of work. And it is the reparations conversation that most unsettles people. And I'm generalizing here, right? Very broadly, but it's reparations, which, as I've heard from people, signals that, Ryan, what you're asking for is something that I earned. I earned this, and you're asking for it. And if you all, whoever that is, or if you all would just work harder, save more, be less prodigal with your finances, then you wouldn't need reparations. But I think what reparations, to Lori's point about saying the word, it requires us to recognize that there has got to be a structural response to structural racism, that there's no amount of personal responsibility or hard work or saving or working overtime that can close that racial wealth gap. That racial wealth gap is by design. And so asking for people to be more responsible personally doesn't appreciate how that racial wealth gap got there, right? Reparations is saying, hey, we need a response to a structure. And so I think that's the first sort of answer to the affirmative action. And then, sorry, I think I talked so long, Leslie, I lost a thread on the second question.
The other thought was the GI Bill. Yeah.
So the GI Bill that's it exactly. I mean, so what's fascinating is in the report I shared, we argue that fewer than 100 Black people in New Jersey were able to take advantage of the GI Bill. But the GI Bill was genius in that it created whole middle class communities, right? It gave returning veterans a chance to get to the middle class, including through home ownership. That was decidedly not made available to Black veterans who returned home. So that kind of thing, it's a very intentional effort to address a harm, is exactly what I think reparations calls for.
We've gotten some specific questions about specific ways reparations could be implemented, things like enacting a negative income tax. Jim Frieswick suggested, and I don't know whether that's something that's in the conversation that you might be interested in addressing. I also think, the point you're making about how people respond to the idea that reparations mean money taken out of their pocket.
Also, I'm sorry, adding to that, there's a question related from Tara Mellon that says that, is there any initiative to fund reparations from tax revenue from cannabis sales in New Jersey?
Yeah, that's a great, I was anticipating that question would come up, so that there were a number of our partners who didn't necessarily love the idea of legalizing marijuana, but thought that that would be the best way to repair the harm from the war on drugs, that Black folks and brown people could, previously disproportionately incarcerated for doing this thing that's now made legal, that they could use that expertise to own dispensaries and to begin to build wealth. I will say to you, I'm very nervous about how that will actually play out. There was a fierce fight to get a Black person on the commission. Initially, there wasn't one not representing the government. So there now is one, but even the rollout of how they created the commission causes real concern. And so we'll see. I'm cautiously optimistic about money being returned, but I mentioned I'm from Denver, Colorado, and it hasn't played out quite that way in Colorado. So, I don't know how that plays out here in New Jersey. I think that's certainly a part of it. Here's the thing, though. Right now, New Jersey has, I was talking to Brandon McCoy from New Jersey Policy Perspective about this. New Jersey has a $10 billion surplus. $10 billion surplus, right? It would mean they were the governor and others were worried that we would have a deficit, and instead we have a $10 billion surplus. And I lift that up because when we have conversations like these, the thing you often hear is we don't have the resources, or there's no money, Leslie, you want that thing, but there's just no money for that. And in New Jersey, that's not our reality. And minus a $10 billion surplus, it wouldn't be our reality. The question is, are we willing to make those investments? And the reason why the reparations task force bill hasn't moved is because the Senate President, Steve Sweeney, the Assembly Speaker, Craig Coughlin, are worried that the task force will meet and it will come up with this price tag of what New Jersey owes. Like, that's real talk. That's the concern, is how much will it cost? And so to avoid having that conversation, they've decided to not have a conversation at all, right? Which is why the task force bill hasn't moved. And this, I'll shut up after this, but this gets to Lori's point earlier that, one of the painful realities about being Black, like there's all manner of beautiful things about being Black, but one of the challenges about being Black, especially doing this work, is the reality that you could have, as we do, every Black elected official in the legislature supporting this bill, right, as we do. And we could put every Black person, it's about 1 million Black people, every one of the 1 million Black people supporting this bill, and it wouldn't move. It hasn't, right? The issue is that not that we don't have enough Black support or even brown support. Like, the story of America is that movements have been successful when non-Black people, white allies, join with Black and brown folks to advance racial justice. And I'll say to you very candidly, we have struggled in that area. Craig Coughlin, the speaker, he represents a district that includes Perth Amboy, right? Perth Amboy was a major port that imported enslaved people. I promise you, Craig Coughlin will be somewhere on Juneteenth. I promise you, and there'll be a flag, he'll be at some ceremony praising Juneteenth. But what he has not been willing to do is advance a bill that would make Juneteenth really meaningful. And so that's why I'm so excited about this conversation, because what we really need to say the word, we need more of our allies who are not Black and brown to say the word. and to push those elected officials. If Craig Coughlin tonight, or Steve Sweeney, or some of our white legislators, if they begin to get calls from their white constituents pushing this bill, I promise you the bill would move. It just would. That's just a fact. That's just a fact of how race works, right? That even in this work, you know, if it's just Black folks, if it's just brown folks pushing it, it won't move. It has always required a multiracial effort, and white allies are central to moving this work forward. And this bill will pass when we have enough of our white allies standing with us to move it forward.
GAIL, who spoke up before, raised a worry that that if we can move forward with reparations legislation, that how do we handle any potential backlash from those who aren't yet convinced that this is legitimate? And you know, as we're working to communicate to the public at large and get people on board, you know, my question is, are there precedents and comparisons that we can draw to other things that have had less pushback to help people understand why this is so important? Karen Secular, a longtime member, brought up the Conference on Material Claims Against Germany that you know, that was reparations from post-war Germany. Are there things that have happened domestically or foreign that have worked successfully that we can use to help convince people who need convincing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, I just want to own, you know, that this conversation is really, you know, if there's a curve, you know, on this conversation, you know, it's like the conversation is happening, like the president, as I mentioned, is uttering the word. You know, there's discussion about it in Congress, but only one state has passed a reparations task force. Now, as you mentioned, there were reparations provided in the context of the Holocaust for Japanese folks internment camp. Like, I think we have seen reparations have happen, but what we're asking here is just a sort of a path to what reparations might look like in the context of a task force. So what I find fascinating is that what we really just want to do through this effort is to finally have a conversation around how you would get to reparations thoughtfully. But it can't really be done if what folks esteem is comfort, you know? I mean, it is a word, like we just got to own that. Like, it's a word that makes us uncomfortable. And the question is why? Like, what is it about the word that causes folks not to want to say it? And what is it that would ultimately, like, what's the worst thing that would happen? Like, we just have to game this out. So even as I've talked about it, right? I see, like, I've talked to folks, I see, you know, even shifting, and I guess we just have to own that it's uncomfortable, but then we think to unpack, like, why it is that it makes us uncomfortable. I don't think that people deny that there's harm. I mean, those racial disparities are shared. I mean, if you look at police violence, it just happens so systematically from city to city, state to state, right? Why is that? Mm-hmm. And we're in a moment, you know, to Lori's point, millions of people were moved to the streets in the last year. The question is, can we harness that energy to do something concrete in policy and law? Mm-hmm. Otherwise, what happens is, you know, I'll lift this up. This arises in the police context, but, you know, there were massive protests across New Jersey and across the country in policing. And our legislature in the last year, I want to be accurate, didn't pass a single meaningful police reform bill, right? And so I think very often elected officials, even when they sound and change and feel progressive, right? They are very often, I mean, you all know this better than me, they're very often keepers of the status quo. And they don't move until they're a thoughtful group of folks who are like demanding action on a thing. And so sometimes we have to force our elected officials into glory, kind of like Abraham Lincoln, right? People think about Abraham Lincoln as like the great emancipator, but ultimately what he wanted to do was just keep the country together. He would have done that however he could have. We'll celebrate him on Juneteenth for signing the Emancipation Proclamation. But the reality is he was pretty good with slavery. And if he could have kept the Union together and had slavery, he would have. And in fact, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It only was effective in those rebelling Southern states. And he didn't send federal troops there to enforce that. So in fact, the Emancipation Proclamation by its own terms didn't really free any enslaved Black folks. It wasn't until federal troops went into those places like Galveston, Texas, and told them they were free. So I think, you know, Lori, I'll ask you if I've missed anything there, but I think it's a moment to do uncomfortable things. It's a moment to make change. I mean, we could be the second state to do it. That's significant. And when our friends in other states or even other communities ask us, what are we doing about the subject of race? We're doubling down and having a conversation. So we push the state legislature to create a task force to talk about how you repair harm. And by the way, we call it a reparations task force bill.
Ryan, it seems from questions we've seen come in that one of the sort of conceptual humps that people have a hard time wrapping their heads around, and that if we can conquer this, it might free people up to put pressure on legislatures, is are questions about who deserves reparations. Barbara, did you want to talk about that? I think you had
well, yes.
Questions.
And then I have another question. Well, okay, I could talk about that as far as how do we determine who gets reparations. Now, number one, is this for only descendants of slaves, Black people in America, or descendants of Caribbean slaves? You know, who gets reparations? And what about people who say, I don't know my family history, who my family was enslaved by? How is the determination made?
Yeah.
How do you think it should be made?
I mean, that's a great, so I think that's another great question. I'm not punting on that, but I do think that is, you know, one of the things that the task force would need to decide is that question. There are a number of different perspectives. You know, there's some who hold the view that American descendants of slaves only, right? So those Black folks who were brought to this country enslaved to this country, right? So not to the Caribbean, but to this country, they will be entitled to whatever reparations, right, ultimately are made available. There are others who believe that even if you weren't born in this country, but you came from, say, Jamaica or the motherland or somewhere else, and you came in the height of Jim Crow, right? You were subject to those cracks in the foundation that constrained your opportunities, that you'd be entitled to slavery, to reparations. So, I mean, there are a number of schools of thought, all of which would be, I think, the charge of the task force to really take on how that would play out. And here, I think the task force, the way the legislation is written, the governor would choose some folks to serve on it, the Senate Majority Leader, the Assembly Speaker. There are some of the organizations on the line that would be represented, but the task force would really set forth, I think, what the policy should be, and then who the repair would flow to. As a practical matter, if you thought about reparations, particularly on the investment side, is strengthening communities separated from wealth, right? So if you thought about, so one of the policies would be, you know, free or reduced college, community college, student loan debt cancellation. If you thought about that, focusing on specific areas, very low incidence of home ownership, you would absolutely capture a broader swath of people, right? So I think there are a lot of ways to do it. The beginning of it really, though, I think is to have the conversation in a formal setting. I mean, even this conversation we've been having for the last hour and 15 minutes. I mean, imagine if we spend time, right? New Jersey Living for Change and SOMA Action, we created our own task force. And we first dove into the history of slavery. And then together we just try to discern. So one, let's look at the racial wealth gap. There it is. What do we do? What policies do we need to put in place around that? right? We could come up with a very thoughtful list. The challenge with that approach, though, is the goal of the task force is for New Jersey to take responsibility for its role. That's why the Institute hasn't just convened some of our partners and said, hey, let's create our own task force. Because I think for us, the part of the resolution here is to get the state to take responsibility for its role in the harm and for repairing the harm.
I have another question that's kind of percolating in my mind. I'm trying to we have seen many examples, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, of backlash, you might call it, like from Obama's presidency, then we went to Trump, and then we had all these crazy responses to different issues with respect to Black Lives Matter and issues like this. While, this is I'm asking this question so that we can, or there can be a preparation or readiness for things like this. Now, let's say that reparations is passed and we start to get whatever it is that we get for reparations, whatever that is. There's a group of people, and perhaps even more than we realize, who are going to be very, very upset about that. Very upset about Black people getting whatever, or maybe just because they feel jealous or they feel it's unfair or things like that. Do you see any longer term issues that would make not things worse, but more complex after giving reparations, like along the lines of backlash or something like that? Am I making sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you said that, I have, Black Wall Street fresh in my mind. I do think there have been examples of Black people doing well and then efforts to harm. I mean, Tulsa, Oklahoma was a good example of that. I mean, I think there have also, I have been someone who loves history and civil rights, like I have on my wall a picture, you can't see it here, but a picture of Bloody Sunday. I love that picture of the march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I think we're in a point in our country where we can make allyship a real thing, right? Yes. And I think so what would be the hope is that as we deepen this conversation, we have allies who see the conversation through to the end and who stand with us where there is backlash. And we've seen that happen time and time again. Like where there's resistance, there are also people who stand with us to meet the resistance. And I think we would need to call upon that. But
I was thinking, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm just thinking the nature of the backlash that we saw after Obama was so horrific, with ending with this January 6th thing that is nearly tearing the country apart.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what will happen after this.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think you're right. I think there's a couple different ways to look at the backlash from Obama to Trump, which is to say, I think democracy has always been contested, particularly for people of color in this country, right? That it's always been an exercise that's been characterized by periods of expansion and then contraction. So reconstruction, expansion, contraction. You can't, in America, elect a Black president 2 times and then not elect a Donald Trump. Like, I just think that's like the nature. I think it's just the nature of democracy. And so I do think it's such an important point, Barbara, because where there have been advancements with Black people or people of color or women or who whichever group, right, is underrepresented, there's always been an effort to scale back whatever progress is made. I think that's just a function of, and I'm not trying to diminish the point you're making.
No, absolutely.
I think it's absolutely right. I think, but we're at, this reparations conversation, we're at a point where, we're far from the backlash of the thing because we're trying to get the thing to take flight, right?
Mm-hmm. You're on mute, Leslie.
Sorry, thanks. So we have so many questions pouring in, and I know we've already run over the time we've asked everyone to commit to us. What I'd love to do is to be able to share these questions with you, Ryan, after the meeting, and then if you have answers that you'd like to share back, we can disseminate it to the assembled group, if that's okay with you. There are lots and lots of details. I think one of the most important questions that we need to address, though, before we release everybody, is in addition to supporting the movement to establish a reparations task force in New Jersey, are there other things that people can be doing to support Black-led organizations that are doing this work, and other things we can be doing to disseminate information in our communities to help build understanding and awareness? Like, what can we be doing that's most constructive?
Yeah, so great question. So first, on the reparations issue, I invite you all to join us this Saturday in Newark at 12 at the Lincoln Memorial. I think it's going to be a great day. The weather's supposed to be pretty good. There's some rain, I think Lori shared with me in the forecast in the morning, but I'm prayerful by the time we get to the afternoon, we should be good. So please, even if you're just still gathering information about the effort, please come learn more about it that day. The second thing I'll lift up is we have on our website this document we created called Black in New Jersey. And so the image I showed you of the stairs, you can find it there. And then on the inside, we have, a number of policy proposals in each of our areas around closing the racial wealth gap, transforming youth justice, keeping communities safe, ensuring democracy for all, and repairing harm of racism. Repairing the harm of racism is the section in the back where you'll find the piece about reparations. So I encourage you to take a look at our website where you'll find this document. You can also, if you want it, I can send it to you. You just ask Leslie to provide my email. I'd be happy to send it to you. I guess I'd say just, broadly on your question about supporting Black-led organizations, Leslie, as you were saying that, talking to my wife about it rose in a different conversation, but it was a question about sexuality and LGBTQ issues and how people identify, and she was having a conversation with a friend who said, I just don't understand. I don't totally understand the various designations, how people regard themselves. And then my wife showed this video of a woman who was saying, allyship is not necessarily that you understand, but that you trust the people who are saying they need an ally, right? Because if you rely on a really keen understanding of whatever the issue is before you join in, sometimes you miss the window. And so you hear these, slogans, trust Black people, trust Black women. I think part of allyship is that you obviously want to understand enough to talk intelligently about it, but it also might require support before you've mastered whatever the issue is, right? And so I lift that up in response to your question, Leslie. There are a lot of groups, Black-led groups led by people of color who are asking for allies and doing their level best to fight their fight and can use support. And that support doesn't mean that you offer blind support, but it may mean that before you understand all the answers to the questions you have, that you trust that the folks fighting for the thing have a reason to fight for it, and you stand with them, and you continue to learn as you stand with them. I think, for example, if the folks on this bridge, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right, on Bloody Sunday, there were 600 of them, which I find noteworthy because there weren't like a million. There were 600 of them who assembled on this bridge to march over it, to dramatize to the world that Black people should have the right to vote. I would imagine when they came over the bridge and they saw the Alabama State Troopers, they had a whole lot of questions, right? Maybe they didn't resolve all the questions, but there was a moment where they had to ask themselves, am I going to stand here or not? And I think that's part of what allyship is, that even as you're learning, you're trusting that the folks you're standing with need the thing they're fighting for, and you stand with them to fight for it. So I lift that up as an idea, and Leslie, I look forward to the questions for sure. Thanks, Mara and Barbara, for letting me join you tonight, and Lori for joining us as well.
A pleasure. Well, Lori just
Absolutely.
pointed out that we should tell everyone that that you can sign up for updates on this initiative on the Institute's homepage. If you look in the chat, actually, it's already been flooded with too many comments. I'll put it in again. I had posted your web address. Let me do that again. There you go. So that you and Lori promises you'll get newsletters and won't get bombarded, but there'll be ways that everyone can get involved. It's hard to top the Pettus Bridge, but Barbara, were there any final questions from that you gathered from SOMA Action that we really need to address before we disband?
Okay, well, I do have one question, I guess, a very important question. In addition to signing the petition, what can we do to support Black activists, people in general, anti-racist, support Black activists in the push for reparations legislation or any other kind of social injustice? What can people actually do?
Yeah, great question. So the way the legislation moves in New Jersey, right, it's pretty straightforward. It's like there's the Senate president is Steve Sweeney.
Mm-hmm.
On the Assembly side, Speaker is Craig Coughlin.
Mm-hmm.
No bills move unless they move them. So the Reparations Task Force bill hasn't moved at all because neither of those men, because one of our core partners is Charles Boyer, Reverend Charles Boyer, who says that there's a real irony around doing racial justice in New Jersey, a state that's controlled by 3 Irish white men, right? So this is of course, because the Governor Murphy is also a white man, he's also Irish. So, so that's how it works. So there's, so we've been focusing on pushing Craig Coughlin to move the bill. And so to your question, Barbara, pressure on Speaker Coughlin, and you can use that phone to action tool, 400 years, NJ.org. Is a way to reach out. There's also, you can hold forums in their districts. Again, each of them is running for re-election this year. So if there's anyone who is in Craig Coughlin's or Steve Sweeney's district holding events, we'd be happy to join you at those, urging those elected officials to be responsive to their constituents.
They're down south, both of them in South Jersey?
So Steve Sweeney is in South Jersey and Coughlin is in Central Jersey. Okay. Part of this district is Perth, Amboy, and Woodbridge.
Oh, right.
But I think we have every confidence that when the bill gets to Governor Murphy's desk, that he'll sign it. It's those 2 men decide when it moves. So, for example, it hasn't had a hearing, which is quite remarkable. Like we managed to talk about all manner of things, but for this particular thing, we've not been willing to have that conversation.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Leslie, you're muted. There, what?
There we go. So we should wrap up now. I appreciate everyone spending so much time with us this evening. Ryan, is there anything that you'd like to add in closing?
I think that's it. I've enjoyed it. I appreciate you all being so attentive. And I know that we started off, there was beautiful sunshine, and now I think it's hiding. So appreciate the time.
Thank you so much. Really wonderful program.
Awesome.
Everyone, I hope everyone enjoyed the discussion and learned as much as we did. In upcoming days, we're going to be sharing calls to action to support the initiative to create the New Jersey Reparations Task Force. We hope you'll take advantage of those calls to action as opportunities to make your voice heard. And do please check the chat for the Institute's web address. But thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Ryan, for your expertise and your insight, and everyone in the audience for sharing your important questions. We will relay everything that didn't get airtime tonight to Ryan and